Welcome back to the Vybrational Stage Podcast. Throughout this week, we've been following a fascinating progression. We began by asking a question that many successful professionals quietly ask themselves at some point in their careers. I don't know what if matters is really mine. At first, it sounds like a question about priorities, about purpose, about burnout, about trying to regain clarity. But as we've explored together, something much deeper began to emerge. Because whenever we ask what matters, another question naturally follows. Why does it matter? And when we begin examining why something feels important, we eventually arrive at perhaps the most significant question of all. Who taught me that this was supposed to matter? That single question has the potential to change everything. Because today we aren't simply talking about productivity. We're not talking about work-life balance. We're not even talking primarily about meaning. Today we're exploring identity itself. Not identity as a label, not identity as a personality assessment, not identity as a resume, but identity as the invisible architecture through which we experience our entire lives. Who were you before achievement became important? Who were you before responsibility became your reputation? Who were you before success became part of your identity? Who were you before you learned who you were supposed to become? Those questions aren't meant to produce immediate answers. They're meant to create space. Because transformation rarely begins with certainty. It almost always begins with curiosity. Executive reflection. If someone removed your job title, your accomplishments, your responsibilities, and everyone else's expectations for just a moment, what part of you would still remain? Looking inward like an executive. One of the things I've always admired about thoughtful leaders is their willingness to examine systems. When a business begins struggling, effective executives don't simply tell everyone to work harder. They investigate. They examine processes, culture, communication, decision-making, resource allocation, leadership. They know that outcomes are rarely random. Outcomes emerge from systems, and if the outcome isn't what you want, the system deserves your attention. That way of thinking is remarkably effective inside organizations. Yet something fascinating happens when we turn inward. Many of the same people who would never accept a superficial explanation for declining business performance accept remarkably superficial explanations about themselves. I'm just not wired that way. I've always been driven. I've always worried. I've always needed to stay busy. I've always been the responsible one. Those statements feel factual, but are they? Or are they descriptions of a system that has been running for so long it now feels indistinguishable from who you are? What if your internal world also contains systems, invisible assumptions, learned emotional strategies, inherited expectations, unquestioned definitions of success? Not because anything is wrong with you, but because every human being develops them. And just like any organizational system, they continue producing predictable outcomes until someone becomes curious enough to examine them. Executive reflection. If your mind were an organization, what recurring outcomes would suggest it's time to examine the operating system rather than simply asking yourself to perform harder? Identity is built, not born. Identity rarely arrives in dramatic moments. It accumulates quietly, layer after layer, conversation after conversation, expectation after expectation, experience after experience. Imagine standing in front of an ancient cathedral. Its architecture feels permanent, timeless, as though it has always existed exactly as it is. But every cathedral began with a single stone, then another, then another. Years passed, generations contributed. Eventually, no one noticed the individual stones anymore. They simply saw the structure. Identity develops much the same way. Very few individual experiences define us. Instead, thousands of ordinary moments slowly become the lens through which we interpret ourselves. A compliment, a criticism, a success, a disappointment, a family expectation, a teacher's comment, a parent's approval, a coach's disappointment. None of these seem particularly significant on their own. Together, they begin constructing an entire worldview. Eventually, we stop seeing the individual experiences. We simply experience the person they appear to have created. Executive reflection. What individual stones may have quietly become a part of the architecture of your identity without you ever consciously choosing them? The architecture of adaptation. Children are extraordinary observers. Long before we understand psychology, we understand belonging. We learn quickly who receives approval, who receives criticism, who receives attention, who gets overlooked, which emotions feel welcome, which emotions create discomfort. Without realizing it, we're constantly gathering information. If I succeed, what happens? If I stay quiet, what happens? If I help everyone, what happens? If I disappoint someone, what happens? These are not intellectual exercises. They're survival questions. And the nervous system is brilliantly designed to answer them. Perhaps achievement became associated with safety. Perhaps responsibility became associated with love. Perhaps perfection became associated with acceptance. Perhaps independence became associated with emotional security. None of those conclusions are evidence of weakness. They are evidence of remarkable intelligence. The human nervous system adapts because adaptation increases the probability of belonging. And for a child, belonging feels like survival. Executive reflection. Which qualities do you admire most about yourself today? And how many of them originally developed as adaptations rather than conscious choices? When adaptation quietly becomes identity. Here's where something subtle begins to happen. The strategy that once served us slowly becomes who we believe we are. A child who became responsible becomes the responsible one. A child who achieved becomes the successful one. A child who stayed strong becomes the one who never struggles. Over time, the strategy disappears. Only the identity remains. Imagine an organization that created emergency policies during a crisis. The crisis eventually ends, but no one removes the policies. Years later, employees simply assume this is how we've always done things. People often live exactly this way. Strategies developed decades ago continue operating long after the original circumstances have disappeared. Yet because they have been running for so long, they no longer feel like strategies. They simply feel like reality. Executive reflection. What emotional policy might your younger self have implemented that your present-day life no longer requires? The invisible operating system. This is why awareness matters. Not because awareness changes your personality overnight. Awareness changes your relationship with a system that's already running. Many successful professionals continue making decisions through emotional software installed decades earlier. Software written by childhood, family dynamics, culture, achievement, fear, approval, responsibility. Not because they're weak, not because they're broken, but because the software has never been questioned. The remarkable thing about software is that it quietly influences everything while remaining largely invisible. Your beliefs about success, your relationship with rest, your willingness to disappoint others, your leadership style, your marriage, your parenting, your ambitions, even your understanding of happiness. The software isn't your enemy. It simply continues doing exactly what it was designed to do. The question is whether it's still running the version your present life actually needs. Executive reflection. If someone conducted an audit of the assumptions driving your decisions, which assumptions would you confidently claim as your own, and which ones might simply be inherited operating instructions you've never questioned? The narrator behind the voice. Most of us believe the voice inside our minds belongs entirely to us. But what if much of it is borrowed? Think about the messages you've heard throughout your life. You should work harder. Don't disappoint people. Be realistic. Success means good people always, winners never. Over time, those external voices became internal narration. Eventually, they become so familiar we mistake them for ourselves. Perhaps one of the greatest gifts awareness offers is not silencing the narrator, but finally asking who taught this voice to speak. Executive reflection. When your inner narrator tells you who you should be, whose voice does it most closely resemble? Awareness doesn't erase identity, it reveals it. Awareness isn't about rejecting your past. It isn't about blaming your parents or your culture or your profession. It's about seeing clearly. Because the moment you recognize that a belief was learned, you are no longer completely identified with it. You become its observer, and observation creates freedom. You cannot redesign the architecture of a building you cannot see. But the moment the blueprint becomes visible, possibility appears. Not because you've become someone new, but because you're beginning to recognize what may have been there all along, beneath the expectations, beneath the performance, beneath the inherited stories. Perhaps the self you've been searching for has never been missing. Perhaps it's simply been waiting beneath the identity you learned to construct. And that brings us to the question we'll explore together in part 2. What actually happens when awareness begins gently dissolving the stories we've unconsciously been living? Stay with me, because what we're about to explore isn't the loss of identity, it's the rediscovery of the part of you that existed long before you learned who you were supposed to become. Part 2. When the story begins to loosen. Opening reflection. Awareness is not an identity crisis. Welcome back. At the end of part 1, we arrived at a question that can feel both unsettling and strangely liberating. What happens when awareness begins dissolving the stories I've unconsciously been living? Many people assume that questioning their identity will create confusion. That if they begin examining long-held beliefs about themselves, they'll somehow lose their sense of direction. But in my experience, something very different happens. Awareness doesn't create an identity crisis. Awareness reveals that much of what we believe was our identity was actually a collection of adaptations, assumptions, and inherited narratives. And those are not the same thing. There is a profound difference between losing yourself and discovering that you have been carrying versions of yourself that were never entirely yours to begin with. For many executives and high-performing professionals, this realization can feel disorienting. Not because anything is wrong, but because their identity has so often been reinforced by external success for decades. The promotions, the performance reviews, the growing responsibilities, the praise for always being dependable, the reputation for solving problems, the admiration for caring more than anyone else. None of these things are inherently unhealthy. The question is whether they become experiences you had or in identities you felt compelled to maintain. That distinction changes everything. Executive reflection. Have you been building a successful career or maintaining a successful identity? There's a difference. Success can quietly become a mirror. Most people believe success simply measures performance. But psychologically, success often becomes something much more powerful. It becomes a mirror. Not a mirror reflecting what we've accomplished, but a mirror reflecting who we believe we are. When success becomes identity, something subtle begins happening beneath our awareness. Every achievement becomes an emotional confirmation. Every setback becomes personal contradiction. Every compliment reinforces identity. Every criticism threatens it. Notice what that creates? Success no longer feels enjoyable. It becomes necessary. Rest no longer feels restorative. It feels dangerous. Because if your identity depends upon continually proving your worth, slowing down begins to feel like disappearing. This is why so many accomplished people struggle to enjoy what they've already built. Their accomplishments never actually satisfy the identity. They simply feed it for a little while. Then the identity quietly asks, what's next? What else? What more? Who are you without the next achievement? No finish line can satisfy a question it was never designed to answer. Executive reflection. Has achievement become something you enjoy, or something you unconsciously require in order to feel like yourself? The stories we inherit without permission. One of the fascinating realities of being human is that none of us begins life with a completed philosophy. We inherit one, sometimes intentionally, often unintentionally. We inherit beliefs about work, about money, about love, about masculinity, about femininity, and about strength, about vulnerability, about leadership, about failure, about aging, about success. Some of those beliefs serve us beautifully. Others quietly limit us without ever announcing themselves as limitations. Think about the phrases many of us heard growing up. You have to earn your place. Hard work always comes first. Don't make mistakes. Keep your emotions to yourself. People are counting on you. Success means security. These statements often come from people who love us deeply. They pass them on because they believe they're helping us navigate life. And perhaps they did help for a season. But inherited beliefs are not necessarily permanent truths. They're simply perspectives handed from one generation to the next. Awareness invites us to ask a compassionate question. Does this belief still reflect reality, or does it simply reflect history? Executive reflection. Which belief about yourself has survived the longest? Simply because you've never paused long enough to question whether it's still true. Identity protects itself. Here's something that often surprises people. The moment we begin questioning identity, identity often resists. Not because awareness is wrong, because identity believes it's protecting us. The mind says, if you stop being indispensable, people may not value you. If you stop proving yourself, you may fall behind. If you stop caring everyone, everything could fall apart. Notice how convincing those thoughts sound. Not because they're objectively true, because they've been rehearsed for years. Identity always prefers familiarity over uncertainty, even when familiarity causes exhaustion. Even when familiarity creates burnout. Even when familiarity slowly disconnects us from ourselves. The familiar feels safe. Awareness gently asks whether it's also free. Executive reflection. Is the resistance you're feeling protecting your well-being, or protecting an identity you've simply become accustomed to carrying? Beneath the performance. Imagine an actor who played the same role every night for 20 years. The audience applauds, the performance has become polished, the lines become automatic. Eventually, people stop seeing the actor, they only see the character. Now imagine something even more fascinating. The actor begins forgetting where the role ends and where they begin. Many professionals experience something remarkably similar. the competent one, the dependable one, the problem solver, the leader, the provider, the caretaker, the achiever. These roles are valuable. Society needs people who can lead, create, and contribute. The problem isn't the role. The problem begins when we forget it's a role. Because every role eventually deserves rest. Identity often refuses it. Executive reflection. Which role in your life receives the most applause? And when was the last time you allowed yourself to step off the stage? Awareness doesn't remove your strengths. One fear people sometimes have is this: if I stop identifying with achievement, will I lose my ambition? If I stop proving myself, will I become complacent? Interesting, the opposite often happens. When identities loosen, performance often becomes healthier. Leaders still lead, parents still parent, professionals still contribute, but they begin doing so from freedom rather than from fear. Achievement becomes expression instead of validation. Responsibility becomes contribution instead of identity. Success becomes something you experience, not something you must continuously become. That shift is subtle, but it transforms everything. Executive reflection. What might your work look like if it became an expression of who you are, instead of proof of who you are? The quiet beginning of freedom. Freedom rarely arrives dramatically. It doesn't usually announce itself. Instead, it often begins with a quiet recognition. I don't have to believe every story my mind tells me. I don't need to keep earning an identity I've already outgrown. I don't have to confuse my adaptations with my essence. Those recognitions seem almost insignificant until one day you realize they have quietly changed the way you experience your entire life. Because awareness doesn't force transformation. Awareness simply removes the illusion that unconscious living is the only option. And once you've seen that architecture, you can never completely unsee it. Which brings us to the final part of today's exploration. If awareness begins revealing that so much of our identity has been constructed, what then remains underneath? That is where our journey concludes in part 3. And perhaps it's also where the entirely new relationship with yourself quietly begins. Part 3. Rediscovering the self beneath the story. Opening reflection. What remains? We spent this week asking questions that many people spend an entire lifetime avoiding. Not because they lack courage, but because life moves quickly. Responsibilities accumulate. Careers expand. Families grow. Calendars fill. Expectations multiply. And without ever making a conscious decision, we begin living from identities that were assembled over decades. We've explored how identity is shaped, how adaptation becomes personality, how inherited beliefs quietly become our own internal narration, how achievement can become a mirror for our worth, and how awareness gently begins revealing the architecture we've been living inside. Now we arrive at perhaps the most beautiful question of all. If so much of what I believe was me was learned, what remains? Many people expect a complicated answer. I don't think it is. I think the answer has been present all along, not waiting to be created, waiting to be recognized. Because beneath every expectation, beneath every performance, beneath every role, beneath every inherited story, there has always been an awareness quietly witnessing your experience. It has been present through every success, every disappointment, every promotion, every setback, every chapter of your life. It has watched identities come and go, yet it has never needed one in order to exist. Executive reflection. If every role you've ever played has changed, what is it that has quietly remained present through each one of them? You were never the story. One of the greatest misunderstandings we experience as human beings is confusing the story with the storyteller. Think about the stories you've carried. I'm the responsible one. I'm the achiever. I'm the one everyone depends on. I'm the strong one. I'm the fixer. I'm the provider. Those stories may describe important chapters of your life. They may even describe admirable qualities, but they are still stories. They are descriptions of how you've moved through the world. They are not the totality of who you are. The storyteller has always been larger than the story. Just as the sky is larger than the clouds passing through it. Clouds change, the sky remains. Roles change, awareness remains. Stories evolve, awareness continues witnessing them all. That realization doesn't diminish your accomplishments. It places them into their proper perspective. You don't have to stop succeeding. You simply stop requiring success to explain your existence. Executive reflection. What if the most important thing about you has never been what you've accomplished, but the awareness that has experienced every accomplishment? Living from choice instead of conditioning. One of the gifts of awareness is that it restores choice. Before awareness, conditioning feels inevitable. After awareness, conditioning becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, choice quietly returns. You may still work hard, but not because your worth depends upon it. You may still lead, but not because you need everyone else's approval. You may still strive for excellence, but not because perfection has become your identity. The external behaviors may look remarkably similar. The internal experience becomes profoundly different. One is driven by unconscious obligation. The other is guided by conscious intention. From the outside, few people may notice the difference. Inside, everything changes because life no longer feels like something you're constantly trying to earn. It begins feeling like something you're finally able to experience. Executive reflection. Where in your life are you still operating from unconscious obligation when conscious choice is now available? The executive who leads from awareness. Throughout my years in business, healthcare, and leadership, I've noticed something remarkable. The leaders who create the greatest long-term impact aren't necessarily the ones who know the most. They're often the ones who know themselves more clearly. They understand that every decision emerges from perception, and perception emerges from the assumptions we rarely examine. When awareness deepens, leadership changes, listening changes, relationships change, conflict changes, decision-making changes. Not because someone taught a new leadership technique, but because the leader is no longer unconsciously defending an identity. They're simply responding to reality with greater clarity. That may be one of the most valuable forms of leadership available today. Not leadership built upon performance alone, leadership grounded in self-awareness. Because every organization eventually reflects the consciousness of the people leading it. And every family does it too. Executive reflection. How might your leadership change if you no longer felt responsible for protecting an identity, and instead focused on responding wisely to what is actually happening? The journey continues, VSP number 4, in the Core Problems Library. One of the things that excites me most about where VybeShift is headed is that these conversations aren't isolated episodes. They're becoming an integrated body of work. Each core problem we've explored has revealed another piece of an invisible architecture shaping our lives. When your mind pulls you into fear, when everything feels like too much, I can't turn it off, and now I don't know if what matters is really mine. Every exploration builds upon the last, not because life can be reduced to a single answer, but because awareness deepens through repeated recognition. That's exactly why VSP number 4 is such an important milestone. Rather than offering another collection of techniques, it invites you into a deeper exploration of how identity, perception, and awareness interact beneath the surface of everyday life. And as the core problems library continues to grow, you'll begin to see something remarkable. These aren't separate problems. They're interconnected expressions of the same underlying architecture. Different experiences, different systems, the same invitation to see more clearly, to live more consciously, and to rediscover the part of yourself that has never been broken, never been lost, and never needed fixing, only remembering. Executive reflection. Looking back across the core problems we've explored together, what recurring pattern have you begun to recognize beneath all of them? VybeShift blog preview. As always, today's conversation is only one part of this week's exploration. The VybeShift podcast helped us recognize the experience. The Vybrational Stage Podcast explored the architecture beneath the experience. Now it's time to bring them together. This week's VybeShift blog integrates both conversations into one practical exploration, helping you connect recognition with understanding and offering a framework for living from awareness rather than inherited identity. If this week's discussion has resonated with you, I think you'll find the blog to be the natural next step in the journey. You can read it by following the link in the show notes. Closing reflection. Coming home to yourself. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Perhaps the journey of self-discovery isn't really about becoming someone new. Perhaps it isn't about constructing a better version of yourself. Perhaps it isn't even about fixing what appears broken. Perhaps it's something much quieter than that. Perhaps it's remembering. Remembering that before you became successful, before you became responsible, before you became indispensable, before you became the person everyone expected you to be, there was already an awareness experiencing life. Whole, curious, present. Not because it had all the answers, but because it didn't need to become someone else to be complete. The stories you've lived matter. The roles you've played matter. The work you've done matters. None of it has been wasted, but none of it ever has been the entirety of who you are. And perhaps that's the deepest invitation of this entire week. Not to abandon your accomplishments, not to reject your responsibilities, not to erase your story, but to recognize that the one living the story has always been infinitely larger than the story itself. Thank you for joining me for this week's Vybrational Stage Podcast. Until next time, keep exploring with curiosity, keep leading with awareness, and above all, keep rediscovering the extraordinary person who has been quietly waiting beneath every expectation you were taught to carry.